So we're going to continue talking about animals and how humans are, we are an animal. As we left off on the last part of the lecture, we were looking at the mammal branch of the evolutionary tree and how the last common ancestor of all mammals, doesn't matter what you are, what type of mammal, but all mammals had those key features, mammary glands and hair. That's very generally what we use to define something as a mammal. We don't see hair on fish, snakes, birds, lizards, uh, frogs, toads, etc. We don't see it. It is what we consider at this point a unique or two unique mammalian features, mammary glands and hair. But as I mentioned in the last lecture, within the mammals, there's diversity. How do you give birth? Is it like the platypus or the monotremes up here where they lay eggs? Or is it giving birth to live young? Now, live young is not a unique mammal feature. Some sharks give birth to live young, but sharks don't have mammary glands, they don't have hair, they don't have mammal characteristics, which is why they're not classified as mammals. But again, we give birth to live young as a human. So do the kangaroos or the marsupials, being the pouched mammals, and then we can see that other branch coming down here. The placenta is what makes us different than the marsupials. But please keep in mind, we are not the only mammal that has a placenta. Horses, cats, dogs, raccoons, all sorts of different mammals have placentas. All right, so that makes the mammals kind of different than the other ancestral groups or our other related groups like the amphibians, the reptiles, etc. But working it backwards just for a moment, we want to talk about what makes a chordate different, because mammals are in this chordata classification, but so are the reptiles and the amphibians and the fish and all these other animals out there. Now, not every animal falls under chordata. Chordata is unique. Any animal that inherited these traits went down a different evolutionary path than the other animals, like the jellyfish and sponges and things like that. The insects are not going down this path. So we want to back up just briefly and talk about, well, what makes a chordate different? And what traits did we inherit from that ancestral chordate? Right? So here are the four key traits. Actually, I'll just use arrows to identify an organism as a chordate, a member of phylum Chordata. Because within the animals, there's a lot of different phylum. There's over 30 recognized phylum of animals. Chordata is just one of those. Most of the animals we probably are familiar with fit under there, but there's still a lot of diversity out there. Like mollusca, phylum mollusca, mollusks, snails. They don't have these chordate characteristics. So the key characteristics, there are four of them. Pharyngeal pouches, number one. So up in the neck region here, throat region, neck region of the embryo will be these little pouches or bags. That's the first chordate feature. Number two, dorsal tubular nerve cord. Dorsal means to the back of the animal. So think about the shark fin above the water, that's the dorsal fin. So the back of the animal, there's a tubular nerve cord. Just inside, or we would say anterior to that nerve cord, is a thing called a notochord. That's number three. So that red line here, in the embryo, it's actually like a thickened rod, almost like a cartilage rod. And then fourth is what's called the postanal tail. tail that sticks out beyond the anus. So when you look at all members of chordata, we all have tails. Now, some of them are very pronounced, like your cat's tail, your dog's tail. Some of them are very reduced, like the primates, the apes in particular. We have a tailbone called a coccyx. It doesn't stick out of our body. It's reduced, but we still have that bone structure. All right, now the pharyngeal pouches. During chordate evolution, these pouches will develop and become specialized structures. All right, so the pharyngeal pouches become different head and neck structures. It just depends upon which chordate you are with what those become. In some members of chordata, they become gills. Others, they become inner ear bones. But head and neck structures is what the pharyngeal pouches will grow and develop into. Okay, number 2, the dorsal tubular nerve cord. That structure will grow and develop into the spine and the brain. So our spinal column, the nerve cord there, and then in certain chordates, it will develop into the actual brain structure. So you can kind of see, ooh, right here, that's your spinal cord. And then up here is where the brain structure will develop. All right, number 3, the notochord. Now, depends upon what you are, what you develop into. Most chordates, this will develop into the vertebral column, the backbone. That's the structure that protects our spine. And to a certain degree, you could say the vertebral column, an extension of that is the skull, the cranium, which protects your brain. Now, I do want to mention, not all members of phylum Chordata have a backbone. Now, I'll show you some examples. They're weird kind of animals, but they are Chordatas because they have the 4 key features. All right, post-anal tail. Well, you guessed it. That develops into your tail. So the coccyx in humans, that's the tailbone. There's a bunch of little vertebrae on your backside that are tucked in. That develops from the post-anal tail that we can see present here in an early chordate embryo. So again, depending upon what path you go down as a chordate, you may have some variation on these structures. But to be a member of Chordata, all the structures have to be there during embryological development. What you do with it after that point, well, that just is determined by your genetics. But our ancestor, the chordate ancestor, had these 4 characteristics that got handed down to the descendants. And each descendant group or lineage, they evolved slightly differently in some to suit those individuals or that environment to be adaptable, and that gives us our diversity of chordates. Now, I mentioned not all chordates have the vertebral column here. So here's an example of a member of phylum Chordata, but they never lose those 4 characteristics. Those 4 are there all their lives. So there's our dorsal tubular nerve cord. There's the right above it. There we go. Right above it is going to be that notochord. And then post-anal tail, that's the caudal fin. And then the pharyngeal pouches are what develop into the gill bars and these slits here, that what we see in this area here. So all 4 characteristics. but not having a backbone. It's kind of a weird thing for this group. These are known as the lancelets. That's the type of chordata. It superficially resembles a fish, but it's not actually a fish because it doesn't have the fish characteristics. All right, so again, a weird, goofy one. Still a chordata, just not the same as us. Another goofy one, even goofier. This is called a tunicate. These are chordates. They look like bags with two openings in them. Same thing, they still have those four characteristics, the four main chordate features, but they lack the vertebral column. So these guys are chordates, but they're not going down the same path as us. Now here's the embryo that we're probably more familiar with. Here's a human embryo on the left, and then a chick or chicken embryo on the right here. So all the characteristics are there. All those features, those four features we've talked about are there. Those are going to be present. The difference with this, let me scoot over here. The difference with this particular group is these guys are known as vertebrates. So they would actually go into subphylum Vertebrata. Oh, didn't mean to capitalize that. Okay, so subphylum Vertebrata. So phylum Chordata, subphylum Vertebrata. And the reason they have those vertebrae, or this, their Vertebrata, excuse me, is they develop a vertebral column. That vertebral column is just simply bone, a bony case around the spine that protects it. So the lancelet didn't have it. The tunicate, they sure as heck don't have it. They don't have that vertebral column. See? Tubular nerve cord, notochord, no vertebral column here. Chordates, but not vertebrates, or officially vertebrata, to sound fancy there. Okay, so we're all animals. It's just figuring out what makes each animal group a little bit different. So now, as we're talking about animals, we go, okay, we keep looking at new and different and kind of unique, fun features. Where did these things come from? That's the idea, is how did we get the structures we have? Where did our features evolve from? Well, let's take a look at our legs and arms. Where did they come from? Well, let's thank this ancestor. Oh, no. Sorry, got some technical. I'm just trying to scoot that over. There we go. Okay. So where did our arms and legs come from? Well, we have a four-limbed ancestor. We go back far enough. Our ancestor had four legs, four limbs. This evolved from fish. Fish gave rise to amphibians. Amphibians gave rise to reptiles. Now, reptiles, I have to use a little arrow here. Reptiles get credit with all sorts of cool diversity. Lots and lots of different groups evolved from the reptiles. So reptiles, they get credit for giving rise to birds, dinosaurs, love them, and mammals. All three of those groups trace their ancestral origin back to the reptiles. So what we'll do in the next part of the lecture is talk about this ancestor here, this weird little, I don't even know which one to call it, squatty, flat tetrapod thing and take a look at how it gave rise to the mammals.